Hello, my name is Amanda Grover, and I'm going to be taking you through part one of our VITA, our Volunteer Income Tax Assistance Services for West Michigan training. This training is designed to provide some volunteer information, some of the filing basics, some of the screening and interviewing information that's common at the tax sites, going through some of these basics and really getting a good handle on what to expect at the tax sites. This information is available on LinkLearn certification as well. I've created this module to kind of condense the information as well as provide a little bit of direction as to what to anticipate at our local tax sites. So I'm going to jump in what you can expect from this training. I broke it down, the federal tax law information, into about 5 parts. So this is how the different modules run and some of the topics that are included on them. There's also additional training for the state information, the city information, Affordable Care Act. This is all designed to be just information at your fingertips for you to run through these modules at whatever speed is convenient for you and to utilize them at your convenience. So first, I like to cover the different volunteer positions so that everybody knows what to expect to see at the tax sites and so that you have a good understanding of how the tax sites operate and who's necessary to be there. So for a VITA site to operate, you absolutely have to have somebody that's certified as what's called the site coordinator, and there has to be at least one other volunteer. You're not going to see this at very many sites, however, because most of our sites are pretty busy. You're typically going to see, hopefully, a lot of greeters. We're hoping to get more and more greeters. We've seen an influx in them, but we are still looking for people to be greeters at our tax sites. So if you know anybody that's interested, or if you have an inclination to want to do any sort of greeting, please follow through on that. All of the contact information for the program is listed on the volunteer website. If you have any questions, please contact us and let us know if there's any groups that are interested in volunteering in any capacity. So tax preparers and site coordinators are really what this training is geared towards, and that's what we need the most. We need more volunteer tax preparers and more people to certify to the site coordinator so that they're responsible for the tax sites. But know that those greeting positions, that the interpreters, that the data input people, our quality reviewers are typically our site coordinators. It's usually the same position all rolled up into one. But we need all of these different parts and pieces to make sure that the tax sites operate. So like I said, I'm going to focus all this training on the tax preparers and site coordinators, but know that we do definitely need greeters, that the greeters do play a huge part in our tax sites. It's not just them saying hi. It involves people helping the people to check in, making sure they're there for their correct appointment, doing appointment reminder calls, helping people fill out information. It's really a more involved greeter position, and I think that a lot of our greeters find that they like it because it keeps them busy. They really feel like they're working with people and helping out the whole tax site and the whole program in general. So it's a really fun and good opportunity for people to be involved. We definitely need those other pieces though too. We need people to help us with the language interpretation from time to time, as well as people to help with the data input, because we do have so much information coming in such a brief amount of time. So tax season is typically February 1st through April 15th, and we definitely need all hands on board during that time. So like I said, we're going to focus this tax training on tax preparers and what it looks like to certify as a tax preparer. These are the different topics. I'm not going to go through each of them individually about what each of these are about. That's covered in throughout the 5 module components of the federal tax law training. But what you do need to know, and what we're going to talk about a lot today, is about the VITA volunteer standards of conduct, as well as the screening and interview process, and what certification looks like, what to anticipate for that. So first, I like to start off by explaining what returns we do and don't do. There are returns that we definitely just don't have the capacity to do. The program is set up to assist low to moderate income families, so the returns that we're doing are not typically very complicated. They're not designed to be. So the training that we cover is pretty basic. It's over basic general tax law. And so if you have a good idea of what that is, then a lot of this training is going to be pretty easy for you. If this is all brand new information, know that it's not hugely complex. So what I like to start with is making sure people understand the type of returns that we do not do at the tax sites. If somebody comes to the tax site and they cannot substantiate their identity, so they don't have a social security card as well as ID, we cannot do their tax return. Just they have to either reschedule or they can utilize one of our computers and use what's called myfreetaxes.com, but they have to prepare their taxes on their own. They want volunteer assisted taxes done, then they have to come in with all their income documents, all of their forms, all of the required documents in order for them to keep their appointment. If they don't have anything, then that's what the greeters really help to distinguish and helps them save time so that they don't fill out the intake and interview form. And if they don't have everything, they can go ahead and just reschedule their appointment, and the intake and interview person, whether it's another tax preparer or whether it's a greeter, can explain what the client needs in order to come to the tax site prepared. The clients are told when they make their tax appointment over the phone what to bring with them. So for a person who's looking at receiving assistance at one of our tax sites, they call 211, and call 211 not only reviews the information they need, make sure that they're eligible, but also schedules the appointment. So the call specialists really spend a lot of time with the clients and try to inform them exactly what they need to make sure that they can come to our sites prepared. They come in and they don't have a W-2 or some income form and they need to have it. They indicate that they've worked somewhere or that they're just waiting on it and that they'll just have you prepare the return without it. We cannot do that. So also if there's a W-2 that's been handwritten and you're not sure about the legitimacy of it, if there's any situation like that, confer with the site coordinator, but we don't do returns for if there's any sort of information that's missing. Rental income, typically and just generally, we don't prepare a tax return with it. There are times with the military certification that we can look at doing that, but only under those circumstances if somebody is military certified and if the client has been in service. So typically, if they have rental income, we can't do their tax return. We can do a very basic scope of royalty income, so that's for our advanced preparers, and we'll get into more information about that in our third module. That's all about income. But we also can't do certain businesses. So if there's a business that earns over $25,000, that's also out of our program scope. And if these are the situations, then we can just refer the client to go to either reschedule their appointment, or in some cases with like the rental income, that they will want to consult a paid preparer. If you're confused on any of this or if you're not sure, there's always resource material. Always feel free to confer with your site coordinator. If there's a big issue, feel free to call Carl Lewis or me, Amanda Grover, and we can go through anything over the phone. We're happy to address any of your concerns. So know that you're not ever completely by yourself when you're decision making, that we really all hands on deck with this program. So I keep talking about volunteer certification, what that looks like. So let me go through that and give you an idea of what to expect and anticipate. So there is a certification that the IRS requires for all of our tax preparers, and that's basically just to confirm that the information that is on the tax return is up to the IRS standards. So we want to make sure that the taxes we're doing are done correctly and that there's no issue for the client when they leave the office. So we have the test and retest basically. It's publication 6744. We do have those in hard copy, so if you want a hard copy of that, please let Carl know. Carl will get you that packet for you so that you have the hard copy of all the materials that we have on hard copy. You can also access everything online. The certification itself is online. It's available at the linklearncertification.com website. That's basically the IRS homepage for all things that are VITA related. So you're going to get really used to utilizing that website and its resources. It's also available at our volunteer website through Goodwill so that you don't have to memorize any more than you absolutely have to. You have two chances to take the test and pass with an 80% or higher, so you only need an 80% to pass. It's open note, open book, it's not timed. You do have to prepare returns to arrive at the answers that are on the test, so it does require quite a time commitment. I recommend going through your book, taking a look at the questions that are on the test and answering what you can immediately. Also working on the practice problems before you go in and launch the exam. So if you have any questions about answering or about getting information on any of that, again, feel free to contact D'Angelo Johnson or Carl Lewis or Amanda Grover with the VITA program. Volunteer protection. So another reason that we have this certification is to make sure that our volunteers are protected. We want to make sure that they understand what they're doing, that they've been prepared in the basic tax knowledge that they need to complete a return and to be successful and to provide a good quality return for the taxpayer that's coming in for service. So it really makes sure that you understand what you're working on. And also to know that these tests are they're very comprehensive. I'd say they're much more difficult than what we typically see at the tax site. So if you can pass these certification exams with an 80% or higher, I'm confident that you'll be just fine at the tax sites itself. Also, for the volunteer protection piece, if you're certified, then you're not personally liable for the tax return. So that's another huge piece. A lot of volunteers are concerned about that. So I like to make sure that everybody understands that if they are certified, then the point of certification is to make sure that they don't have to take any sort of personal responsibility. They are a VITA volunteer, and the program will cover any sort of mistakes that are made. I also like to say, you know, when I do talk about this, is to say that it's not very often that we have a lot of mistakes on the tax returns. Between your knowledge, the quality review process, and the software that we use, it's not very common at all for mistakes to be made on the tax return. I like to talk about the ethical behavior, how it's defined by the IRS, and some of the unethical behavior that they like to talk about, because you're going to see this on the standards of conduct exam. In most cases, unethical behavior is when there has been something acted upon with the intent to disregard established law. So if there's not any sort of professionalism, if there's nothing in place to make sure that we're doing our due diligence and doing everything properly, that's when there's an issue of unethical behavior. I will say that the program generally across the country has had a few issues here and there, but for the most part, unethical behavior isn't anything that we see typically, but it is very serious, and that is why we like to cover this in such great detail. So I'm going to go through the 6 standards of volunteer conduct. So this is what the exam will be over that's online. So feel free to go through and click through that slideshow, or to, if you feel like you've covered the information enough in this training, just go through and take the exam. Or if you have any questions, this is a really good opportunity for you to ask questions and to write things down so that you can follow up with asking questions as you go through and get your certification. So the big thing is making sure you're following the 10 quality site requirements, and those are going to be on the next slide. Those are basically just requirements of how the site operates. Another big thing about being a VITA volunteer is we want to make sure that we're understanding that we cannot accept any sort of payment or solicit donations at the tax site themselves. If there is a person that's insistent upon assisting and providing payment for the service, just let them know that the program exists so that people can save that money and keep it in their pocket. If somebody does want to make a donation for the program on behalf of somebody who received service or anything like that, that has happened. And that person, if people do want to do that, they can write checks to Goodwill and in the memo line indicate that it's for the VITA program. And that way the income stays for our local service and support our local program. We're not to solicit any sort of business. So say there's a CPA and he wants to volunteer at our tax site, that's perfectly fine. But if there's a tax return that's maybe out of program scope or anything like that, we can't solicit business for that volunteer at the tax site. So we can't, even if there's a return that's out of scope, we're really not supposed to say anything about going to any other tax repair specifically. We can't be there to solicit or promote business for any other agency from the tax site. So I know it's hard to do because sometimes the intention is really good, like For example, if somebody comes in and they have rental income and you know somebody that personally does tax returns, they do them at a very low rate, you've only heard great things about their preparation, we can't suggest that person to the taxpayers at the tax site. And that's just a liability issue. We want to make sure that if we can't do it, then we don't want to be liable for telling somebody to go somewhere else if in case there are any issues with that tax preparation. So no soliciting other businesses. We can't knowingly prepare false returns. So that basically means that sometimes people will come in and they'll try to claim someone that they're not eligible to claim as a dependent on their tax return, or another issue like that comes up. We can't knowingly prepare the tax return, and that kind of goes along with number 5 as well, that we can't engage in criminal or infamous dishonest information on the tax returns. So if somebody has received tip income, we can't just leave it off if we know that it's there and if we have documentation on it. We've got to make sure that we're claiming all of the income and all the information is correct. It's better to have a tax return with a smaller tax refund that's done correctly than to get somebody a tax return with a huge refund amount, because it's just going to catch up with them and get them into trouble down the road anyway. We want to make sure that we treat all of our taxpayers as well as our other volunteers professional and courteous and in a respectful manner. I've never had any sort of issues with this. All of the tax sites I've been at and the volunteers I've been around have been really great. They've been happy to be there. For the most part, the clients come in and they're just super excited about getting their refund, and they're very thankful for the service. So overall, it's a very, very great environment to be around, and I haven't really had too many issues of any respect issues. So the 10 quality site requirements in the previous slide, I did preface this, and so there's 10 quality site requirements that we just like to make sure are being followed at the tax sites. So there's the certification, and that's basically making sure that you're certified to do the tax return that's within your scope and that you're there and that you are certified to do. So making sure you're staying within the level that you've learned. This again is why we really like to promote people to certify to the advanced level before taking any of the tax information and before taking their certification. We really promote that people certify to the advanced level, because that way they can do basically any return that comes into the door. And if somebody certifies to only the basic level of our scope within our program, then they have to be very careful about what tax returns they do and what they don't do. That can cause backups with that at the tax site, because people come in for appointments, so it can make things a little bit challenging. All of our site coordinators have to certify to the advanced level, and like I said, last year we were able to get just about everyone to the advanced level of certification, so I'd really like to do that again. I think it makes people more comfortable when they're preparing the return as a volunteer as well. Make sure you're using the intake and interview form. There's a whole training on this, and I do talk about the intake and interview form at length a little bit later in this presentation, and that's because it's a requirement by the IRS that we use it. It's a very useful tool, so I know people complain about filling it out, and that's why we try to have greeters around as well to make sure that we're providing the necessary support for people to have the intake and interview form filled out. But you as a tax preparer, you'll find that it's really extremely useful and helpful working with that intake and interview form. So we want to make sure that everyone is completing one of those. Also, we need to make sure that we're using the quality review form that's on the very back of the intake and interview form. The quality review is a process that you just basically go through to check somebody else's work. You're checking somebody else's tax return that they prepared, and usually they'll check yours. You can swap to make sure that the return has been looked at by another person. That way, if you have any questions, you can ask the tax preparer and say, why did you put this here, and confirm that it makes sense and that the tax return was done properly. The quality review checklist is on the back, like I said, of that intake and interview form, and just as a checklist to help you as volunteers go through that process of checking other people's work and making sure you've done everything on the tax return of the one that you're preparing as well. There's the volunteer agreement. So there has to be a volunteer agreement at every tax site that you volunteer at. If you get the volunteer agreements to Carl Lewis, he'll make sure that they are at the tax site. So as soon as you pass certification, you basically get what's called a volunteer agreement. You just get that over to Carl and he'll keep track of all the volunteer agreements and make sure that they meet IRS standards and that everything is signed in at the tax sites. Also make sure that the standards of conduct agreement is signed, and that's with that form too. It's basically just making sure that you accept responsibility, that you've gone through the training, and you understand what you're expected of at the tax sites. And that's what these trainings are for, just to make sure that you understand that. So again, if you have any questions, make sure that you're asking us to make sure that we can help you get all the information clear in your mind before you get to the tax point. And we want to make sure that we're doing this at the tax sites. This more so is something that falls on behalf of the program coordinator and the site coordinators. So make sure that everything is being e-filed on time. There's some civil rights posters and some other signage that's required at the tax sites. Again, that's something for the site coordinators. Greeters can typically help with this and make sure that all of our posters are up. We have to make sure that even if your site doesn't operate every single day, that these posters are seen and that they can be seen by the taxpayers that come in. Sometimes at some of the sites we have to take them down and put them up each time. So it's just going to depend from site to site, but we try to keep them up at all times just so that we know they're up. We know that there's nothing that we have to worry about there. The next two items, so the site identification number and the electronic filing identification number, those all are printed on the tax return automatically. They're within what's called the TaxWise template. So they're basically built into the software to be able to print on all the tax documents that you as the tax preparer are creating. So don't worry about that. That'll be automatically printed on there. Lastly, the thing that you will want to worry about, though, is the privacy and confidentiality, making sure that you're being as confidential with the client information as possible. A lot of the time, this involves just pointing to information as opposed to saying it out loud. Working with the client to make sure that they feel like their identity and that their personal information is being protected, basically. You're also, there's volunteer name badges that you're supposed to have on at the tax site, and that's to make sure that we can identify you as volunteers, that the taxpayers that come in understand that you're a volunteer and that you're certified and supposed to be there doing taxes. It also helps the site coordinator if there's like a site coordinator filling in at a place that they don't usually volunteer. There's just a lot of different circumstances where it's helpful. So the interview process, before starting the tax return, it's really good to go through that and take an interview form with them. Make sure you introduce yourself, make a little bit of small talk. I know that this is the part that a lot of people actually get a lot of the most joy from. This is the part that they really appreciate the most, is really talking to the client, getting an understanding of what their circumstances are. You go through that intake and interview form and substantiate all the information that's on there. Just confirm that all the information looks correct. Again, you're making sure too that the identification has been checked. So if there's a greeter at your tax site, a lot of the time they'll confirm and make sure that the taxpayer has both their social security card and identification. But if there's not a greeter, or and actually even if there is, we need to see the taxpayer's information, that identification information, throughout the whole time that they're having their tax return filled out. It's needed at the quality review process, and it's needed a couple of different places at the beginning of the return, so it's easiest just to leave it out. We have had some people get frustrated in the past because they feel like we keep asking for it, so if we just ask them to keep it out and keep track of it, and that kind of alleviates that whole situation. Let them know the process. So a lot of the time people don't really understand. They come in, they know they're getting their taxes done, but sometimes they want to know the process of everything. So just kind of going back and explaining why you use the intake and interview form, what the information provides to you, and then the process of you doing the actual tax return, and probably asking them for some information aside from what they've already filled out. I think preparing the client for what to expect can be kind of key as to avoiding any, in case there's any sort of delay in preparing it, if there's any issues that come up, it helps make them understand and be a little more open to that. So it's always good to ask some questions about everything that they provided you. Make sure that you're on the same page. Inform the client that they're responsible for that information, and that's why they should really be a part of that process and helping to make sure that the return is done correctly, because they are responsible for everything that we submit. So if there's an error on there and it means that they have to pay back money, they're responsible for it. So we do like to make sure that the taxpayer goes through the tax return with us when we're done, and make sure to minimize any of the mistakes in that capacity. Really, there aren't mistakes that really get by unless it's because the client has not told us. But again, I can't say it enough. Just use your due diligence to make sure the return is done as accurately as possible. Again, before starting the return, we need to have either the Social Security card or what's called an ITIN. I don't usually refer to ITINs very often because we very rarely see them at our tax sites, but they do come up from time to time. So when a taxpayer comes in, we want to make sure that we are substantiating their identification. And we do that by basically just looking at that Social Security card, or what's called an ITIN, stands for Individual Taxpayer Identification Number. And what it does is it's basically in place in lieu of a Social Security card if somebody is applying for citizenship. We don't see a whole lot of them at the tax site, so that's why I often just defer to calling them the Social Security cards. We can use somebody's Social Security benefit statement if it has their full number on it. Anything that's government issued, but it can't be like it can't be last year's tax return. We see that a lot. It has to be either the Social Security card, ITIN card, Social Security benefit statement, or like a Medicaid card we can use. And then also the photo ID as well. And we have to have both of those things, and all the information has to match. So make sure that you're being very vigilant of that. That's one of the very strict rules for the IRS, and that's just because we've had so many issues of identity theft in the past. So we really want to make sure that we're looking at that and that we're doing our due diligence to do everything properly in that capacity. Tips for a successful interview. Just make sure that you're confirming information with the client. I know they say that they, sometimes if there's a greeter, they say they just went over this information, but just explain to them that it's so that you can prepare their tax return correctly, that you're just confirming the information, and to see if they had any questions about anything that they filled out on the tax form. I've highlighted some of the really key pieces and things that are often missed. So checking to see if somebody's a full-time student, confirming if somebody's disabled. These are really big pieces of a tax return. They're really small check boxes on this intake and interview form, but they can have a really big impact on the tax return. So make sure you're going through these questions and asking them in detail, and that you're getting all the correct information very well. Also, another key point that I like to point out in this process, make sure that you're getting the telephone number for the taxpayer. We absolutely have to have that. If there's an issue with the tax return, then we absolutely need that in order to make sure that we can contact the client and get everything taken care of, hopefully over the phone. Otherwise, we have to do it through snail mail, and it just takes a really long time. Point to the items so that the client can see that you're trying to be very confidential about this information. You know, don't scream, so is your social security number 1, 2, 3? Just kind of ask the client and point and confirm, you know, are you married? You indicated that you're single, so you're not filing with another person. Is that correct? Confirm the information about the dependents. That's huge, just because sometimes people are not sure if they can claim someone or if they can or can't. So make sure you're using your decision trees and your 4012 resource material, and that you're going through this information as well. On the intake and interview form, so the first page is just information about the client, so their address, their dependents, some of that key information for jumping off and starting the tax return. On page 2, it lists basically questions about income so that you know the sources of income of the client, and so that you can also look at some of the tax situations that may indicate if they should itemize or look at claiming specific credits. So page 2 is basically different checkboxes for the client to fill out and answer. If they've indicated that they're not sure on anything, so you can see that there's 3 columns to the far left, and that's to indicate yes, no, or unsure. If the client is unsure, make sure that you're asking them the question so that we know and can clarify, and then correct it on the intake and interview form itself. These are really nice now. They've added these on the intake and interview form. Right behind the number of the question, that indicates the certification level. So that way you can see if you're only basic certified and somebody comes in with self-employment income, you know that you can't do that tax return. Again, this is exactly why we really encourage everybody to certify at least to the advanced level. So there's also a spot on page 3 of the intake and interview form, and it really asks some questions about the healthcare situation of the client. You're going to find that as a tax preparer that this is kind of a worksheet in an area that will probably help you a little bit better than the client. And that's so that you can kind of separate and confirm the client's information about their healthcare coverage for 2015. Just some key points. Make sure you get to know your client, ask questions, do your due diligence to get everything answered to your satisfaction. Just confirm with them that you're not trying to be nosy, but that you're trying to get this done for them accurately and correctly. And so that means asking some questions about living situations and different relationships within the home. So it's good to ask these questions. It's okay to do. If somebody looks kind of offended, just explain why you're asking them that. For the most part, our taxpayers are usually they are returning, so they're used to these questions, or if they're new and they're new to the site, then usually people can understand pretty quickly the point you're getting at and why you're asking these questions. But sometimes it does just help to explain that. Make sure that if you're uncertain about anything, that you're asking another volunteer or a site coordinator, whoever's available, first, and that you feel confident with what you're choosing and what you're preparing on the return. Also, make sure you ask any questions of the client and that you use your resource information. I think you'll be surprised to see that people really appreciate you being a thorough tax preparer, and they'd prefer you asking questions and maybe it taking a couple minutes longer, but that knowing that it's done correctly. So some interview techniques that are really helpful at the tax site. Make sure you're doing your due diligence to speak clearly and accurately, and try to simplify it. A lot of the time these tax situations are somewhat intimidating for people, so we want to make sure that they're really understanding what you're asking them, and that they understand what they're agreeing to and what they're indicating. Reassure the taxpayer that you understand their situation, but make sure you're asking good questions and that you're getting the information that you need. Allow the taxpayer some time to respond, or if it looks like they don't understand still, maybe try to explain it to them in a different way. A lot of the time our clients also have some sort of disability, so that might impair their hearing or their vision. So make sure that you're also cognitive of that and that you're respectful of that and can be as accommodating as possible. When reviewing information with a client for accuracy, just make sure that you ask yourself if the situation or information is unusual or questionable. If you're not comfortable with it, then maybe ask the client to clarify. And if it still seems like there's something a little off, then it might be worth a time to confer with the site coordinator. So the quality review process, all of the tax sites have a tax site coordinator, but sometimes the site coordinator has to do taxes themselves. It's really good just to get into the habit of doing a quality review. There's a quality review checklist on the back, so on page 4 of the intake and interview form. And it basically goes through, and it's just a nice checklist for you to use, especially as you're preparing your first returns, to make sure you're not missing anything on the tax returns, that you're going back and confirming that the information information that you've identified on the tax return is actually what the taxpayer has provided you. So it's a really good process to go through. We're just confirming that the information is correct, and if there's anything that looks incorrect, then talk to the tax preparer and get that sorted out so that the tax return is in fact thoroughly checked and that it's passed its quality review process. We don't expect you to do these right when you start typically, but it's good to be aware of them, how they work, and not to be timid of the quality review process and participating in that as well. Can really make the whole site operate a lot easier if you work as a team and people review each other's work as opposed to waiting for one person to do it. So this is just a quick snapshot of the actual quality review checklist and then just confirming some of that information. So it comes down to a lot of the time confirming numbers. It's so easy to get numbers switched around on the tax return, making sure that the numbers in the tax return match what's on the documents. Also, there's a diagnostic button that helps do this within the software a little bit, but there's nothing like having another tax preparer look through the information as well. Typically, all the tax returns are e-filed unless the client has indicated that they'd like to paper file their return on their own. We don't mail anything in for the client, so if the client comes in and indicates that they'd like to have a paper filed tax return, then we just print them out an extra copy, and then they are in charge of actually mailing it. We don't take the responsibility of that, and that's also another cost of the program that, quite honestly, the program just can't afford to do. So we e-file the returns, and if there's a reject, you'll see that as the preparer, and also the site coordinator can see it. There's a place where you can put in notes, so you may see that the site coordinator has already contacted the client. But if you see that something has been rejected and you have questions about it, please ask the tax coordinator, the tax site coordinator, because that's only going to empower you as a volunteer to really understand if there are mistakes, how those mistakes were made, why they were made, and what you can do to correct them. So it doesn't happen too commonly, but it is good to review. Some of the common reasons that we see rejections are a lot of the time it's because somebody has falsely claimed a child. So you may have a tax preparer that comes in and the child has lived with them all year and really they're the parent or the person that's supposed to claim the child, but the IRS doesn't really have any control. They don't know who's entitled to claim the parent when these e-files are submitted, or who's entitled to claim the child or the parent or whoever the person is. So it's good to explain that process if somebody does have this reject error. To work with the site coordinator the first time that it happens to explain, well, you know, this is kind of a common error and you'll have to paper file. It's a pretty easy process, but we do like to explain it to the client. Also, sometimes we get a return rejected because the name on the Social Security card and it doesn't match what's on the database. So if somebody comes in and they use an old Social Security card, but they've actually updated their last name, or there's been a situation like that, the IRS may have something different. And sometimes it's just a matter of deferring to the client and saying, well, what's on your current Social Security card? Or sometimes it's just a matter of spelling. And sometimes just you kind of have to do a trial and error and try different spellings of the names or different hyphenations. But usually we can get that fixed at the tax site without having the client have to come back in. Also, I have had a few issues. This is not hugely common, but there's been a few issues with the employer identification number. So what the IRS has does not match what the company has on file and what they've had printed. Sometimes that means that a client just has to paper file the tax return. So we can work with any clients if that does become an issue. Also, sometimes somebody has what's called an identity theft PIN. So it's basically a protection identification number so that we can confirm that the person is who they say they are if they're filing a tax return. A lot of the time this issue just comes up because the client forgets the PIN, and there's no way for us to know if somebody has a PIN until we submit the return and it's rejected if the PIN is supposed to be there and it's not. So that's something we do ask clients, but sometimes they forget or still skip over. Again, it's an easy fix, so it's really not a big deal.
And again, the biggest reason that we have e-file rejection errors is because the tax filer is someone else's dependent. So sometimes we see college age students come in, or younger people come in and they're actually being claimed on their parents' return. If they don't indicate that to the tax preparer, then there's no way for the tax preparer to know that. So sometimes somebody is actually claimed on another return, and we just have to contact the client and let them know that, and let them know the impact on their tax return at that point. So that's all I have to go through for this first part, our training for part 1. Next, feel free to take the Standards of Conduct certification and go through the intake and interview form, the information screening training on the Link and Learn website. So again, that website is www.linklearncertification.com. Always feel free to refer back here to our website for all of your volunteer needs and resource information. The next step is to watch and go through part 2, the next module that you're doing. And as always, if you have any questions, feel free to contact us with Goodwill and VITA Services for West Michigan. Thank you.